And I'm able to share something that is biblically based, not Zach based, and anything that you can weed out as Zach based, please do, and take the stuff that's from the Bible. So, as Matt said, my name is Zach. My wife, beautiful wife Jessica, is sitting in the front row. Our son Sammy, he's 19 months in a couple days. He's in childcare, and we've got one on the way. Second baby in October. So, okay. Is that like you trying to exit me off the stage?
Yeah.
No. Finish on that note. So I've been at JBLM for 7 years. I was 4.5 years active duty, and then the last 2.5 as a civilian and an Army reservist. Just to give you a little background on me. So, Luke 9:23 says, "And he said to them all, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." So I think in that verse, we see that in order to follow Jesus, we have to give a whole life in order to do this. And we can't hold anything back. And so, giving our whole life to Jesus, I see us being able to do that in giving of our time, in giving of our energy, and in giving of our wealth. And so I'm going to talk about the third one tonight, and how I think the Bible describes giving of our wealth in this effort of advancing the kingdom of God. So I've got a handful of verses here, and I'd like to assign them. So if by show of hand you can volunteer, I would appreciate it. The first one is Luke 12:33 through 34. Andrew, thank you. The second verse is 2 Corinthians 9:6 and 7. Seth, thank you, sir. Mark 12:41 through 44. Augie. Appreciate it. I'm going to do the fourth one. It's a long one. And then Matthew 5:42. Brad, thanks. All right. So, one quick thought that I had as I was going over this. All of the verses that I'm going to go over today are in the New Testament. If we look at the Old Testament and the society that was in place then, it was an agrarian society. We are in an industrial society. And so when your wealth, the thing that you produce from your work in an agrarian society is actual crops that you're harvesting or animals that you're raising. And so if you look in the Old Testament, when we're talking about giving, it's really in the form of the first fruits and the firstborn animals. And that's kind of, you'll see most of the verses refer to that. First fruits, firstborn animals, which as an agrarian society, a farmer, somebody who, that's their livelihood, that's a significant thing to offer up to the Lord as a sacrifice. No, I'd say, my guess is none of us have that in our life. We're not actually producing food or animals. So it really comes down to wealth. How are we managing the money that God has provided to us? And so that's why I think it's worth talking about. So the first question in giving that I'd like us to address, I've only got 3 questions, and they're pretty basic, but I think it helps to walk it through like this. The first one is, should I give? And Andrew, if you want to read Luke 12:33 through 34.
Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.
Thanks, Andrew. Luke 12:33 through 34. So, I think Jesus is pretty straightforward in answering this question in what he says here. He says, sell your possessions, give to the needy. So, yes, we do want to give. But I want to focus in on what his reasoning is for doing that and answering the why would we give. And what I think is really important here is what Jesus emphasizes is that if you give of your wealth to those in need for the sake of God's mission, you will benefit. He doesn't say because the need is so great, because there's so many hurting people, because it's not going to work if you don't do it. Jesus doesn't use any of those reasons to encourage this audience to give. It's actually a very shrewd calculation of how are you going to invest yourself? How are you going to invest your resources? And so Jesus says, do it because you're going to get better treasure if you can give of your physical wealth here on this life. You're going to benefit in the next, where your treasure will never fail you. So, and then I think the other reason there, so it's a shrewd investment, and then the other thing is where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So it's kind of a check on yourself, just to make sure that you're staying on track with that mission of following Jesus and giving of yourself. So I think we can deduce from this. Yes. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. And Seth, if you could read 2 Corinthians 9, 6, and 7.
Remember this, whoever sows sparingly should also reap sparingly, but whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver.
Thank you. So here we see Paul is talking to the church at Corinth, and he's specifically talking about a collection that he is putting together for those followers of Jesus who are suffering in Jerusalem at that time. And this is his guidance to the church at Corinth on, okay, I've asked you to do this, kind of what are you expecting, Paul? And he says, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously will also reap generously. So, really, another way to ask this question is, how much do you want? So, if you want a lot of success, if you want a lot of blessing, if you want a lot of, get to see a lot of God's work in your life, then give generously. I think that's one principle at play here, is that we want to give generously if we want to get more. Not to say get more in this life. I'm not going to preach a health and wealth gospel for our time on earth, but get more in the long run. We got this little blip of a life on earth here, and a huge, unfathomable, stretch of eternity. So that's one, is we want to give generously. But then the second verse 7, it says that each one needs to give as they've decided in their heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So we want to give generous, but we need to give cheerfully. So if you have gone past the point where you are giving cheerfully, now it's in vain. Because this is very key for us, I think, to understand when it comes to giving and to offering up our resources to God, is that God does not need our money. There is no shortage of God's power to accomplish His purpose. And so God's got an awesome business plan that is going to be super successful. He's given us the opportunity to get in on, just the outset of this business and to buy some of that stock now before it booms. So is it going to boom if you don't buy some of that stock? Absolutely. It's going to boom. But we have an opportunity to be a part of it and to see an incredible return on what we give. So So, yeah, to answer the question of how much, I would say generous and cheerful. All right, and then the second verse that I want to share under this question is Mark 12:41 through 44. Augie, if you want to share that one.
Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrant. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, Assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood.
Thank you. So here Jesus witnesses a lot of people going and giving to the temple treasury. And we see some people give a lot. And then we see this little widow. Well, I don't know if she's little. We see, I don't want to be patronizing. We see a widow boldly give a small offering. But comparatively to her own possessions, that was like everything she had. So I feel like we see Jesus get this huge smile on his face as he witnesses this woman act in faith when she had no reason to do it. And so I think giving so that it hurts in a way, hurts might be the wrong word, but giving sacrificially to where, yeah, I might not have the perfect 10-year plan, but I see a need and I'm going to give. And as a side note, I don't know how effective the temple ministry was at that time, but Jesus really honored the fact that she gave, not the fact that, oh, the temple's doing these amazing things, we really ought to raise funds for it. But no, this woman was so faithful to give of what she had. So I think the other piece to this is that there should be sacrifice in faith. All right. So let's move on to question number 3. I'm going to read, it's kind of a long passage, but bear with me. This is going to be addressing the third question, which is, to whom should I give? Okay, so we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 9. Guess I could have told you that, so you could have flipped there. 1 Corinthians 9, starting in verse 3. And just to give you a little bit of a background on this, bear with me. It's kind of a long passage, but I think it's really important to understanding what this full-time minister of the gospel looked like for the early church, for Paul specifically, and how financial support was a key component of these early ministers of the gospel. I'm reading a book right now that kind of goes into some of the background in the New Testament, and one of the teaching styles that was prevalent at this time was the Socratic method, and it's all about how you engage your audience with questions. And so it's very much a question and answer style of teaching. And Paul is certainly influenced by this style of teaching, because in this passage he asks 13 questions, like rapid fire. And so if you're wondering why he's doing that, he's kind of using one of the more effective methods of teaching of his day. So starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 3, we're going to go all the way through 14. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So there's 4 things I see in this passage that, to me, point to the principle of giving to the full-time minister of the gospel that Paul describes. And the first one is in verse 7. Where he says, who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? To me, this is just a logical reason. If someone is, the vine dresser planting this vineyard and he's starving to death, that would seem ridiculous. That there is, this harvest in his labor and he's going to die of starvation. Well, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the vine. It's certainly not good for the vine dresser. So it just makes sense if he is laboring in this, vineyard, that he would eat some of the fruit to sustain his own life, because he is maintaining and keeping the vineyard. So the first one is that it's just logic. The next section, verses 8 through 11, I think is really based on the law. So it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? I don't think I ever would have gotten that reading the Old Testament, that he was talking about, spiritual heart. The ox was like a agent for the kingdom who was working as a full-time minister of the gospel. So I'm glad he told us this. But it makes sense, and it's in the law that the ox should not be muzzled, but as they're treading out the grain, they should be able to eat of it. So I would say biblical law demands it. All right, skipping down to verse 13. So Paul makes an important comparison here between the apostles and the full-time ministers of that day, and he compares them to the Levite in verse 13, where he says, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? So in the old covenant and the old, that structure of the temple service, you had the Levites who were employed full-time into maintaining the temple. And that was the way that all of Israel worshiped God. So because they provided that service, they would get part of that tithe that the Israelites would bring, and they'd live off of it. So they'd bring a sacrifice, and the Levites would eat some of that sacrifice. Seeing Paul compare this minister of the gospel to a Levite, to me, makes another strong connection between the financial support, the justification for financial support for a full-time minister of the gospel. So that's verse 13, and the idea is the Levite. Okay, and then the last one, probably the strongest reasoning here in verse 14, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Pretty straightforward. I don't know if there's really much more to say other than it's commanded straight by the Lord. And that's verse 14. So, what I take away is, to whom should I give? So, I'm gonna write up there, the local Levite. This question is brought to you by the letter L. So, the local Levite. If I were to define it, I would say someone whose full-time vocation is to facilitate your spiritual growth and health. So you have to answer that for yourself. Who is that? Who is spending all of their time considering how to best help you grow and make sure that you are in Christ? So I know for Jessica and myself, that's the Hills and the Chongs. They're here, they're investing in us, and we can tangibly see how we are growing spiritually because of their full-time service to us. And so we have, I guess, a clear conscience knowing that we're supporting those who are laboring in our midst. And not just laboring, but giving their whole life and their vocation to it. All right, and then the second part of answering this question is Matthew 5:42. Brad, if you could share that.
Sure will. Matthew 5, verse 42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
I realize I didn't write the first passage up. I'll do that as well. So Matthew 5:42. That one is pretty straightforward. Give to the one who asks you. Do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. I see that as giving to the poor and giving to projects. So if someone tells me, yeah, we're going to go down to Mexico, we're going to build a house, and it's going to be something that we're doing to help this area. Cool. I can see a biblical justification for giving to that project. If I run into someone in Seattle and they're destitute and they're asking for money, I think there's some biblical grounds to give to that as well. I would say the difference is, well, let me write it up there first. Poor and projects. And then this is 1 Corinthians 9, 3 through 14. So I'd say the difference is I see this as being mostly proactive and intentional and planned. So the local Levite's not going anywhere. You're going to continue to support him month after month. So that is intentional and kind of pre-planned. This, I think, is more reactionary. So Jesus met needs wherever he went, and he would, provide for people. And so I think in the same way, we need to be ready and willing to respond when we see the need. We're not going to wipe out poverty in this life. It's just not going to happen. But we can alleviate someone's suffering that we encounter and do it out of the mercy that we've received from Jesus. So, all right. I think I've taken enough time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I've got a few questions for you to chew on. The first one, are you giving cheerfully? The second question, is it a sacrifice? The third one, are you supporting a full-time minister of the gospel? And then lastly, are you willing to give to the needy? Cool. Thanks for giving me your time. Any questions before I head off? Back to my seat.
When you're talking about giving cheerfully, what do you think the tension is between cheerfulness and sacrifice? So if I'm giving, X amount, but I want to increase my capacity for giving, but that extra giving is not comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
would you say that that extra giving is in vain because it hurts when I do it? Or is that working to increase my generosity and the cheerfulness will come after?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at first glance, if it's not even a question of what it does to your budget, if it's so small that it's like, oh, I didn't even notice it's gone, then you might be short of sacrifice. If there is maybe not a hesitation, but man, are we really going to commit to this? Because we could really use this somewhere else. If you have to have that conversation and remind yourself, if it forces you to remember the gospel, and then in remembering the gospel, you do it cheerfully, I think that might be the best balance I could describe. Where you have to pause and consider, man, do we really believe this? Like, are we throwing our money away? Or is this worth it? And then as you consider, and the Spirit reminds you of what you're doing, then you do it cheerfully. But if it's bitterness all the way through, then we might be beyond the cheerfulness, and now we're not doing it in faith. I don't know. Does that answer that?
Do you feel like sometimes you hope that the heart will follow?
Yeah.
It may not be immediate. Sometimes we might have to give in faith, and then and then we kind of get on board with that, and we start to believe in what we're doing.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I think that's a good way of putting it. That you have to almost have the conversation, like, okay, is this something that I'm going to do or we're going to do if we're married? And I do think obedience can lead and the heart can follow. So I think that's a decent way of putting it. Yeah.
Zach, you've been given for a while. How have you seen it play out in the military with promotions or transitioning from the military to a civilian job? I know you had one lined up pretty soon afterwards, but what did that look like? Your mindset of how am I going to give, going from a stable paycheck to not every 2-week paycheck, or of that pay increasing? Yeah,
that's a good question. I do think, for me personally, I have a conviction to give more as I get more. So I do want to be faithful in that. The question is, when you get less, do you give less?
Right. That's
a harder one to do when you've got people that you really love and care. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna give to this huge organization where I'm a small contributor, but no, I'm gonna give to friends who are full-time ministers of the gospel. So yeah, for me, I did take a little cut in pay when I got out of the Army, and that's just the reality. Man, the Army pays captains too much. I'm not worth what they were giving me. But so for me, I made the decision to just continue to give, and it wasn't my salary wasn't cut in half or anything, but it was something that I had peace about, and I felt like there was never a need that wasn't met or anything like that. So I do think it comes down to personal conviction, but my desire is to give more as I get more.
Thanks for sharing that, man.
Cool. Thanks for your time.